It would be a mistake to think that strange stories belong only to dark nights, autumnal evenings, or winter afternoons by the fireside. If anything, the bright light of summer serves only to reveal all the more vividly the horrors that confront us. We might turn to hide in the few remaining shadows, but are they not already occupied? Today's stories take us from sun-drenched California to the good old British seaside, so grab your sunscreen and whatever spiritual protection you may require, and join us, because we're all going on a summer holiday.
Hi, I'm Peter Atkins, and first I want to thank Joe for inviting me to be part of Midsummer Macabre and his ongoing series of author readings. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm going to read something from this book, which was the third volume in a trilogy edited by Stephen Jones. The name of the trilogy is The Lovecraft Squad, and this third volume is called Rising. I'm also in volume 1, and there's a whole bunch of really good people. So if you don't like what you're about to hear, don't let it put you off checking out the work of Stephen Baxter, Mike Chin, Adrian Cole, Brian Hodge, Lisa Morton, Tana Nevo, Reggie Oliver, John Llewellyn Probert, Angela Slatter, Michael Marshall Smith, Steve Rasnick-Tem, and Joe Fletcher. And Kim Newman is in the other two books as well, and doubtless a couple of other people, but I don't have them at hand. No offense intended. So what do you need to know about the actual story? It's called The Thing About Cats. Most of the titles in the books are sort of riffs or winks on existing H.P. Lovecraft titles. And the only other, there's two things you should know. Although it's very odd for a man my age to think of the 70s as a period piece, this story is in fact a period piece because it takes place in the late 1970s, which really means nothing except no streaming and no cell phones. There won't be any references to that, just like there aren't in Dickens or indeed Lovecraft. And the other thing, and this is more difficult, so you're going to have to suspend your disbelief, is that the first person narrator of this story is not a 65-year-old man. It is a 25-year-old woman So you can turn the video off if you want, if that helps, or close your eyes, sit back, use your goddamn imagination, all right? Let's give it a go. The Thing About Cats. Turns out that by town car, the trip to the Upper West Side is going to take us nearly 40 minutes. Travis, our usual driver, isn't to blame. He's doing his best, but there's a Reagan rally in Midtown and it's screwing up traffic everywhere. About 20 minutes in, Mr. James chooses to point out that he told me we'd have been quicker taking the subway. And so I choose to point out that I married him for his money and that gold diggers are not, as a rule, expected to ride subways. Besides, I add, this Arthur Hillebrand character will still be dead whatever time we get to his penthouse. You say that, Mr. James says, and I have to admit he's got me there. If I had a nickel for every corpse I've had to re-kill for the department in the last 3.5 years, I'd only have about 65 cents, but you get my point. Apparently, Mr. James and I could have taken the subway, Travis, I say through the open partition to the front seat. You could have had the afternoon off. Mix yourself a cocktail and watch Donahue or something. Would you have liked that? Travis finds my eyes in the rear view. What? He says, shaking his head. And miss seeing you in that dress, Mrs. J? I smile at him and turn to my husband. There, I say, because matters have clearly been settled. Why else, by the way? Why not the cops? Circumstances, Mr. James says, and associations. Ah, I say. So, Mr. Arthur Hillebrand is a person not unknown to the Bureau. I fish a cigarette out of my purse and waggle it for my husband's attention. Who is he, anyway? The zipper's in his hand already, bless him. Hillebrand, he says. He was a poet. Christ, I say, drawing in the flame and taking my first drag. No wonder somebody killed him. The private express elevator, into which the building's doorman had ushered us before tapping out an access code on one of those newfangled keypad thingies, takes me and Mr. James speedily up to the top floor, where it opens directly onto the reception area of the late Mr. Hillebrand's penthouse suite. I whistle. I assume the Vatican and Buckingham Palace have got this place beat, but I know a few embassies and country houses that are clearly going to need to up their game. I give my husband a look. I thought you said he was a poet, I say, because come on. Family money, Mr. James explains, nodding at the framed photographs of earlier and more respectable Hillebrands, bank owners, railroad barons, or whatever, and their stern and well-upholstered wives, before extending his hand to the stout fellow in G's drag, who's walking out of the living room to meet us. I'm Mr. James, says Mr. James. This is Tabitha. Was it you who called? Jeeves shakes the proffered hand, though his slightly pained expression makes it clear that he's wondering whether Mr. James has any idea at all about the proper way to interact with household staff. Mr. James is perfectly familiar with the proper way to interact with household staff. He doesn't care for it. My name is Kilgallen, sir, says the late gentleman's gentleman. I did indeed place the initial call to the Bureau using a number with which Mr. Hillebrand had entrusted me, but I don't believe you and I spoke directly. Look, you can certainly choose to remember that his name is Kilgallen, if that's what floats your boat, but I'm just going to keep calling him Jeeves. It's not going to bother him. I'm not going to say it out loud. And besides, at the moment, he's already busy being bothered by the fact that whoever answered his phone call hasn't shown up in person, which makes me wonder whether Jeeves has any idea at all about the proper way to interact with the FBI. If you don't mind my asking, sir, he says, what is it that you do at the Bureau? I investigate, Mr. James says, and gives Jeeves the benefit of his most charming, most confident smile. Somewhat placated, Jeeves grants him a nod before turning his still not sure about all this gaze on me. And I do his dirty work, I say, without waiting for whatever insulting question it is that he's attempting to formulate. I'm really not sure that Jeeves and I are going to get along. My husband gestures to the living room. Shall we? He says. He waits till Jeeves has turned around before treating me to one of his best behave yourself looks as we follow the valet to the crime scene. There's a dead body, all right, and Despite the aforementioned checkered history, which Mr. James and I have had with dead bodies, this one is convincingly dead, very cold and very still, and already starting to discolor. Oh, and missing its head. The curious thing about the body, apart from that, is that it seems to have greeted its demise with an impressive degree of aplomb. It's sitting upright, legs casually crossed, in a tall, straight-backed antique chair made from the kind of dark, heavy wood usually reserved exclusively for churches of the really miserable denominations. An ascot or cravat or something equally ridiculous is laid out on an occasional table beside the chair, and the corpse's white shirt is unbuttoned, revealing a hairless chest which boasts several carefully incised runic markings, though none of them appear to be recent. Both hands rest, seemingly at ease, in the body's lap. His legs are crossed, I say to Mr. James, because I suppose that's what strikes me the most. I mean, who sits cross-legged and unperturbed through their own decapitation? And in dress pants, Mr. James says. His voice is as respectful as he can make it, doing his best to spur Jeeves's feelings, I'm sure, but I still pick up the undertone of dry amusement at this confluence of elegance and atrocity. He turns his head to the valet and keeps his voice gentle. And we're quite sure, Mr. Kilgallen, that this is Arthur Hillebrand, he says. On account of the no head thing, I offer helpfully. Yeah, I know, saucer of milk for Miss Tabitha, but I'm still pissed about that whole implicit and what do you do other than look pretty crap. Mr. Hillebrand's fingerprints are, I believe, on file, should it be necessary to check, sir, Jeeves says, but I'm quite certain. We follow his gaze as he looks pointedly down at the corpse's left hand. It's a moneyed hand, delicate and uncalloused, its fingernails manicured and subtly polished. And the fingers themselves are long and elegant, all 6 of them. Huh, I say. Would you look at that? Mr. James, though, is already done looking at that. He's looking instead at the set of glass-panelled double doors off to the side of the living room's baronial fireplace. Striding over to them, he pushes them open to take a quick glance into the dining room. I sneak a peek too. As dining rooms go, it perhaps wouldn't look like much in the Waldorf Astoria, nor have turned heads on the first-class deck of the Titanic, but it seems perfectly up to the task of serving bacon and eggs to everybody who'd want some, should an emperor and his entire retinue happen to drop by. But Mr. James doesn't appear to be interested in counting the 24 place settings or admiring the 18th century silverware, the 14th century tapestries. He has that look of someone less interested in what they are seeing than in what they're not. He lets the doors swing shut. Bit of a squeak, to be honest. Jeeves perhaps not quite up to date with his WD-40 duties, and takes a step or two back into the living room. Sir? Jeeves asks, of his quizzical look and his silence. I'm very curious about the cats, Mr. James says. What cats? I say, before Jeeves can answer. There aren't any cats. Precisely what I'm curious about, my husband tells me, clearly weighing the possibilities of accompanying the comment with a smug smile. As I, however, am clearly weighing the possibilities of a drop kick to his solar plexus, he elects to restrain himself. Here's the thing, he says. To the majority of his neighbours in this building, Arthur Hillebrand was commonly known, and far from affectionately, as the Catman. Wait a minute, I say. Is this going to involve a rooftop-mounted signal from a police commissioner and a suspiciously fetishistic costume? No, he says, it's going to involve a suspiciously terrible racket, which by all accounts emanates from this penthouse every night at midnight. The concerted screeching, wailing, howling, and hissing of what sounds like 1,000 cats. Jesus, I say. And all the neighbours could come up with was a disapproving nickname? Why the hell didn't they try to get him thrown out? It'd be a tough eviction, Mr. James says. He owns the building. Owned, I say. A correction of tense, which I grant you is rather petty. But he keeps pulling out all these annoying facts. which he could have shared with me on the car ride over here instead of wasting his time cheerleading for the fucking subway, and it's getting on my nerves. Also, I add, at the risk of repeating myself, there aren't any cats. A small, discreet cough from Jeeves catches our attention, and we see that he's taken the opportunity to trot the mile or so over to one of the room's several floor-to-ceiling bookcases. "The cats are in here, sir," he says, pressing the spine of a leather-bound book on one of the shelves. Well, it's a secret room, of course, and sure enough, it's packed to bursting with cats. No actual cats, you understand, unless you choose to count the few dozen mummified Egyptian ones scattered here and there throughout the collection, but instead what amounts to a museum's worth of feline representation through the ages. Paintings, sculptures, tapestries, photographs, children's toys, board games, revolting Victorian napkins with cute little kittens in baby clothes, VHS tapes of The Black Cat, That Darn Cat, The Aristocats, Island of Lost Souls, signed photographs of Anne Francis as Honey West brandishing her ocelot, and of all three of TV's Catwomen. That half rhyme of "to Arthur from Eartha" must have irritated his poet's ear, I'd have thought. High culture, low culture, ancient and modern, priceless masterpieces, tatty junk. A first edition of T.S. Eliot's Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, a battered paperback of Enid Blyton's The Mystery of the Disappearing Cat. Clearly, if you were in possession of anything with a cat on it or in it and were looking to unload, Arthur Hillebrand and his bottomless checkbook had been your go-to guy. "God," Mr. James says. "Look at the eyes on that one." He's standing in front of a large portrait in oils of the ancient Egyptian cat goddess Bast. It's late 19th century and looks to be by one of the symbolists for sure, if not Jean Delville himself, and certainly school of. While Bast's human body is a pale and voluptuous fin de siècle dream of femininity, her fully feline head is sleek and black and striking, and Mr. James has got a point about the eyes. They stare directly out at the world, cruel, confident, amused. "What do you think she's saying to us?" he says. I have no doubt in my mind. "You're all mice," I say. "Brr," Mr. James says, and averts his gaze from her alarming splendor. Still, it's fairly clear that neither she nor any of her fellow works of art here are likely to be responsible for these reported midnight wailings. "No fooling you," I say. "I'm a detective," he says, with a modest nod. "If I may, sir," says Jeeves, and we see that he's now brandishing an old 78 RPM record pulled from a cabinet behind him. I believe this to have been the source of the neighbour's irritation. There's a floor-standing antique Victrola in front of the cabinet, and Jeeves lifts the lid, cranks the handle, lays the disc on the turntable, and applies the needle. The noise is certainly horrendous. The collective screeching, wailing, howling, and hissing of what does indeed sound like 1,000 cats. But it's also astonishingly loud, wall-shakingly loud. No wonder the neighbours fucking hate you loud. Mr. James waves at Jeeves to stop it, and once the valet's lifted the needle arm from out the grooves and put it back in its housing, stabs a finger towards the large metal horn protruding from the Victrola. "There's no way all that sound was coming from that," he says. "No, indeed, sir," says Jeeves proudly. "The master had it wired up to his recently installed quadraphonic sound system." Jesus Christ, I say, what was wrong with him? Mr. Arthur was an enthusiast of the unusual, Jeeves says, his sweeping gesture taking in the whole room. A connoisseur of the curious, goes without saying. Yet there you go saying it, I say. He cocks his head, mask of civility slipping just a little. "I'm sorry." "Apology accepted," I say. "Tabitha," says my husband in that rein-it-in tone, which he always thinks is going to work. Before Jeeves and I can investigate our antipathy further, something else claims our attention. Off to the left of the Victrola is a freestanding plinth, atop of which is a life-size statuette of a Siamese cat. I really don't know what happens to make all three of us turn to look at it at the same time. Perhaps we sense a great disturbance in the force or something. But I do know that as soon as we do turn to look at it, the statuette steps elegantly from the plinth onto the lid of the Victrola and from there to the floor. Good Lord, Jeeves says, staring down at the cat. The cat stares back at him briefly and then, lest he should think it gives a shit, starts licking its front paw as if it may have picked up something unpleasant from Arthur Hillebrand's rug. Mr. James treats Jeeves to a raised eyebrow. Not an item from the collection with which you were previously familiar, Mr. Kilgallen, he says, and the valet shakes his head, long and slow. The cat, yellow eyes, long sharp teeth, tail flicking rhythmically, precise as a metronome, turns her face to me. Not Siamese at all, I see now. We hold each other's gaze for a moment, and then, slowly, she inclines her head, regal but respectful, like a formal nod of greeting. It's been a long time, the cat says. Good to see you again, moja sestra. Mr. James looks from the cat to me. Of course he does, who wouldn't in the circumstances, but I'm glad to say I married a professional. There's no trace of a double take, and it's no more than a second before he's turning to Jeeves with a smile that appears entirely uncompromised by the presence of a cat who's just spoken to his wife in Serbian. I understand you've had quite the day, Mr. Kilgallen, he says, but I wonder if I might trouble you for a glass of water. Now, while I have little doubt that Jeeves hears this as the obvious code for I need a word with my wife in private, that it is, I have to say he plays his part well. Of course, sir, he says, with just the right degree of unflappable. Anything for the lady? Tabitha? Mr. James asks me. How are you with Singapore slings? I ask Jeeves. Not entirely unfamiliar, madam, he says, though one hates to boast. I still doubt that Jeeves and I will end up as coffee date companions at any point in the near future, but it seems his jib has some cut after all, and it wins a small smile from me before he makes his way to the kitchen, which leaves me, my husband, and the cat. Well, I knew you had a mysterious past, says Mr. James, but we should talk about that at home, I say, already planning what to wear in order to turn his mind to finer things. Don't we have a murder to solve? Mr. James smiles, fishes in his pocket, brings out a quarter and rests it on the back of his thumb. Tell you what, he says. Tails, you introduce me to your sister. Heads, you don't. He flips the coin into the air, and I watch it as it rises. Then I watch it as it peaks. And then I watch it as it fails to fall. Watch it as it freezes in place, a good couple of feet above our heads. Mr. James, when I look back at him, is equally motionless, head tilted, eyes on the quarter, palm out ready to catch it, not moving, not blinking, not breathing. And I assume that somewhere in the kitchen, Jeeves too is currently not doing anything at all, and that my Singapore sling is paused part way between being and becoming. I'm not going to pretend that this state of affairs isn't disconcerting, because of course it is, but I'm already beginning to calm down. Coin and drink, valet and detective are perfectly fine, I realize. They are not frozen in time and space. Nothing alarming is happening to them. Nothing is happening to them at all. It's happening to me. I've not been folded through the continuum for several years, and it remains as disturbing an experience as I remember. I keep my eyes on the almost fixed point of the cat's flicking tail as I follow her between the worlds, through the emptinesses and the vastnesses and the alternating coruscation of colors that last had names before the oceans drank Atlantis. It is every bit as impressive as you'd expect it to be, and I'm sure it would all look fabulously psychedelic in a Stanley Kubrick movie or a Jack Kirby comic book. But I have to tell you that in real life, one's enjoyment of it is significantly undercut by the nausea, 3 parts motion sickness and 7 parts metaphysical dread that invariably accompanies it. But as ever, it's just at that dreadful moment when you become convinced your psyche is about to be permanently shredded to nothingness by the dream winds that you blink, raise your head, and find that you're merely somewhere else, which is distinctly preferable to being in all the somewheres at once. Not that the somewhere I found myself this time isn't impressive. When I open my eyes, I'm standing in an antechamber of the throne room of the Dreamlands, and the cat, perched elegantly on a plinth of carved alabaster, is looking at me patiently, allowing me the necessary moment to anchor myself in this reality stream. "Princess," I say, dipping my head, and she flicks her tail in response. It had been kind of the lady at Alal to call me sister, but the truth is I'm barely of her species, let alone of the royal line. My mother, far from a full-blood herself, had further diluted the line 25 years ago by the romantic but ridiculous step of letting a 32-year-old self get pregnant by a 47-year-old private detective from San Francisco. There is, I gather, no actual rule about such matters in the Dreamlands, but Mum's earthbound dalliance is probably still a topic of discussion in certain quarters of the kingdom. Christ, I suddenly think, is that why I'm here? "Your husband is hardly our concern," the princess says, as if I'd asked the question out loud. Right, the mind-reading thing, a trick that's missing from my quarter-breed's deck. Not that it's actually mind-reading they do, at least not the way we usually think of it. Atalal and her kind are creatures of dream. They don't read thoughts so much as they read emotions and the pictures that might accompany them. Hence the princess's confusion. She received the impression that I was thinking of my husband, a detective in his 40s, while in fact I was thinking of my father, a detective in his 40s. Yeah, all right, Sigmund Freud, I know. Calm the hell down. Sometimes a pipe is just a pipe. "Something is about to awaken," the princess says. "Already its dreams disturb our realm, mutating the territories, breeding monsters from dream flesh, quenching the very stars in their courses. Great Kadath is already fallen, and over the scorched earth of Trefondain, the flayed skins of princelings flap in tatters." "Still not big on small talk then," I say, risking a suggestion of a smile. And she rewards me with that slow narrowing of the eyes that her kind used to signify amused tolerance. At least I think that's what it signifies. Hard to be entirely sure, because it's pretty much the same expression they use when sucking the marrow from the bones of their slaughtered enemies. "There's a war going on in the invisible world, my sister," she says, "though I assure you that its consequences, should we fail, will be all too visible. Battles are waged on many fronts. In your world, for example, there are parties who work avidly to hasten the rising, seeking nothing so much as the eternal oblivion that they believe it promises. Your masters are already learning that there is another sleeper, one who lingers in the chambers of the dream sea, and all our auguries can as yet not tell in which direction his waking will tip the scales. With such a delicate balance, there is no room for tolerance of trouble-making dilettantes who merely seek power in their own right. The idiot in whose nest I found you, Arthur Hillebrand," I say, not so much interrupting as showing I'd been paying attention. Her contempt for him comes as no surprise to me. Her kind don't care for creatures who get magic wrong. And humans get magic wrong all the fucking time, especially the rich and stupid ones. "It was me thinking he was driving his neighbors crazy just out of bloody mindedness," I say. "No, he was trying to summon you." "His ridiculous and barely understood ritual did him little good," she says, though he did manage to gain access to the kingdoms on a few occasions. He thought he could gain power in the world of the spirits, but found instead, as all find who venture here unwisely and unwelcomed, merely the transmutation of the flesh. "Ah," I say, in my best Mr. James manner, "the sixth finger." "Sixth finger," she says, amused. "That's nothing. You should see what his insides are like." "I'm guessing I'd rather not," I say. But you'd have to, surely, she says, like I'm missing a point. I suppose it depends on your choice of method. Choice of method, I ask. For killing him, she says, clearly glad to have had the confusion cleared up. As I say, current circumstances regrettably allow no tolerance for interfering opportunists. He won't be expecting you, per se, but nor will he be surprised that we sent someone. He's learned of our displeasure and has been trying to undo his rituals, burn his books. I'm missing something here. Are you sure there hasn't been a double booking at your end? I say, because judging by appearances, that mission's already been assigned. What? She says. Arthur Hillebrand's dead, I say, severely dead. Atalal tips her head, like something's confusing her or taking her by surprise. You should be getting back, she says, and there's an unusual undertone of urgency in her voice. How much of this will I remember? I ask. I've never been great at remembering things from my dreams. Don't be silly, the Lady Atalal says. You're not dreaming. I'm dreaming. And for now, I'm done with my dream of you. I hardly have the time to take half a step forward and incline my head in goodbye before I'm completing that step in the secret collection room in Arthur Hillebrand's penthouse suite and looking up just in time to see the quarter flipped by Mr. James begin its descent. He catches it smoothly, claps it onto the back of his other hand, and reveals it with a flourish. Tails, he says, without looking. I win. A tiny hint of confusion clouds his eyes for a second, like he can't remember exactly what it was he'd been playing for, or why. Did I win? Well, I say, A, it's your double-tailed coin, so you know, duh. And B, as I've explained to you on more than one occasion, what more could you possibly be looking to win? You've already got me. Yes, he says, and his tone, to be honest, is a little cavalier for my money. A state of affairs I find more than acceptable, he adds, as I trust you know. But wasn't there something... He looks to the plinth beside Mr. Hillebrand's Victrola and at the rather nice but perfectly ordinary Siamese cat statuette that sits atop it. Mr. James is opposed on principle to the creasing of brows. It's indicating, he's been known to say, something a bad actor does. But I think a mild furrow might, at this point, be itching to make itself evident on his forehead as he grapples with the unfamiliar feeling of being unable to not quite remember something that might not quite have happened. Looking past the plinth and its lack of answers to whatever it is that's itching him, he looks to the wall beside the secret door and its row of small and not very good paintings of cats in anthropomorphic guises. Sailor cats, mailman cats, cowboy cats, baseball player cats, guitar-slinging cats in grey suits who are supposed to be maybe the Beatles in their Ed Sullivan days or something equally stupid. Just awful, the whole set. Dull as hell, as poorly rendered as they are imagined, and painted as they are on canvas rather than on black velvet, not even able to lay claim to the dubious virtue of high-end kitsch. And yet Mr. James is staring at them as if fascinated. Pictures, he says practically to himself. Pictures all in a row. There are better ones, I say, gesturing tentatively back at the imposing symbolist portrait of Bast and at the Boris and Bella movie poster, vaguely worried that my husband may have had a stroke while waiting for his coin to come down. No, he says, I mean the other pictures. He waves me forward with him as he heads for the door and out through the living room to the reception area where we first met Jeeves. No Jeeves there right now. He must be a man who takes very seriously the preparation of Singapore slings, I'm thinking, as Mr. James stops in front of the family portrait gallery we'd glimpsed when we arrived. Take a look at them, Mr. James says. I take a look at him instead. This better not be a test, I say. Indulge me, he says. I'm testing an idea, not you. I look at the pictures. Parents, probably. Grandparents, presumably. Great-grandparents, possibly. all in matching frames, all in a row, all mounted on the reception area wall and set between a couple of those narrow doors that lead to linen closets or whatever. What do you see? Mr. James says. Several generations of sourpusses in extremely uncomfortable clothes, I say, fairly confident that he's not going to find much room for argument there. It's a good job you're lethal, he says, because you see, but you do not observe. Yeah, well, you play your fiddle and I'll play mine, I say. What's up with the pictures? It's not the pictures, it's the display, he says, sweeping his hand through the air along the row of frames to end between the last one and the closet door. I see it now. Though I am, I confess, somewhat underwhelmed. There's a significantly larger gap between frame and door at that end of the row than there is at the other. Clearly a household that needs to fire whoever's responsible for hanging its pictures, I say. Oh, wait, do you think it's Jeeves himself? Because those dining room doors squeak too, remember? It's probably a drinking problem. It usually is. He might well be drinking my sling right now. It isn't a picture hanging issue, Mr. James says. There was another picture here, obviously, and it's been removed, and I'm guessing fairly recently. Okay, I say, so a snap's gone missing. Isn't it a more pressing matter that so is Hillebrand's head? Mr. James gets that quietly pleased look he gets whenever he realizes what a clever boy he is. Actually, he says, I don't think that's the head we're looking for at all. The kitchen, which is at the far side of the dining room, and which is where Mr. James leads us now at a slow sprint, is unsurprisingly huge, though most of it is frankly little more than show-off space. In all that square footage, for example, there's only the one fridge. And in that fridge, there's only the one head. Ah, the late Mr. Hillebrand, I say. But Mr. James begs to differ. The late Mr. Kilgallen, he says. Jeeves, I say, because this sad, shocked, and ice-flecked face is not the one I've come to know and have mixed feelings about. The missing picture in the hall, Mr. James says, fair to assume, wouldn't you say, that it would be of the latest scion of the House of Hillebrand? Couldn't be left out there in plain sight if said scion was about to pretend to be his own valet, and neither, unfortunately, could the valet. But that's not quite right, I say. I have it on the best authority that sixth finger thing proves the body is Hillebrand, a souvenir of all his occult dabbling, transmutation of the flesh, if you want to be technical about it. Says Mr. James. Then the situation is perhaps a little more complicated than it first appears. I think we'd best be on guard. He doesn't have to tell me twice. I'd already picked up on the creaking floorboard from behind the pantry door, and I'm spinning in its direction as it bursts open, and Jeeves races at us, a stunningly large cleaver raised in both hands above his head, and rage twisting his face. And by his face, I apparently mean, if my husband is to be believed, Arthur Hillebrand's face. Whichever iteration of himself he is, he appears to think he may have the drop on us. But I'm spectacularly good from a standing start, and I've been fired up for the sport ever since this guy first gave me attitude. Humans are so slow. I don't know what the hell this Hillebrand hybrid thinks he's dealing with, but he's about to learn. I'm sweeping beneath the clumsy swing of his cleaver and slamming a stiletto heel into his crotch before he even sees me hitch my dress to mid-thigh. A sight, let me tell you, that would put most would-be murderers into a frozen and vulnerable moment of erotic adoration, transmutated flesh or no transmutated flesh. He doubles over in the usual manner, allowing me the luxury of a glance across the work surfaces. A kitchen is full of useful tools for any conscientious assassin, and the bread knife's in my hand and busy opening 3 of his vital arteries before he fully straightens up. Disconcertingly, though, he does in fact straighten up. What he doesn't seem to be doing is in any way slowing down yet. Mr. James is leaning back against the Corinthian marble countertop of the kitchen's work island and lighting one of those Gaulois verres, which he insists he smokes for the taste and not the demi-monde affectation. We can assume it was the real Kilgallen who made the call, he says, after Hillebrand appeared to have killed himself to avoid the consequences of his wizardly shenanigans. My husband has apparently decided he can best use this time in the tying up of loose ends, lest worrying about them should distract me from the fight. Hillebrand makes an impressive backhanded slice with the cleaver, which could really do some significant damage were I to choose to stay in place and let it connect. All things considered, my step to the side and downward sweep of the bread knife is the better call, doing enough damage to his hand to make him drop the cleaver. Mr. James takes a nice, slow drag of his smoke. But suicide wasn't really Arthur's thing, he says. Not when there was a perfectly good act of ritual magic waiting to save him. Poor Mr. Kilgallen didn't realize that he was about to become part of the ultimate master-servant relationship. Heads seem to have been the focal point of most of today's activities, so I decided my best plan is to remove the one that's currently busy snarling at me. I'm trying to find the right angle of attack to do precisely that when Hillebrand elects to do the job for me. Thumbs tight beneath his jaw below each of his ears, fingers tight at each of his temples, he gives something between an upward push and a sideways twist, and the head pops up and off like heads are always supposed to work that way. Most of the blood is gone in a single sickening cascade, but the severed trachea and the first few inches of spinal column dangle and twitch unpleasantly as one of the hands moves the head across to plant it squishily in the palm of the other. The head screams at me, which I'm going to hazard a guess, if the fury and hatred in the eyes is anything to go by, is probably die, bitch, die in Eldritch vernacular. Seems like big talk from a severed head resting on a hand, and I'm about to say so, until it raises itself 4 feet above Jeeves's palm, courtesy of the twitching limbs that are suddenly sprouting from the neck, branching out from the dangling spinal column like one of those step frame movies of plants blooming in speed dial. Within seconds, it's an ambulant fucking triffid, spider crawling its way off its former host and heading my way. Ah, Mr. James says, makes sense now. He points his cigarette at the monster, like a professor jabbing a stick towards a whiteboard. Bodies just flesh puppets, heads full of Dreamland's ectoplasm, hence the ability to make the initial swap. Hillebrand's jaw drops open, and the eyes roll up in the head, and though I don't quite see how the vocal cords still have a sound chamber with which to work, a horrific and deafening screech lets whatever neighbours may be listening know that the Catman's not yet done fucking with their sleep patterns. The mutating limbs and the mutating sublimbs blooming from within them by the second are multiplying wildly, spiraling out into the room like some crystalline spiderweb foaming into overdrive, fractal nightmare upon fractal nightmare. Chicken-like feet or claws are hatching from the ends of some of them now and skittering along the walls to help heave the head at the center of the web in my general direction. The mouth, still shrieking, is also masticating and drooling, like it can already taste the smorgasbord of viscera that used to be the hottest housewife on Fifth Avenue. It is fast, it is furious, and it is, in case I'm not painting a vivid enough picture for you, absolutely fucking terrifying. But I've still got some cat in me, despite the interbreeding. And the thing about cats is, once the game's on, we don't scare any more easily than we can be moved to pity. Whether you're cowering against the skirting board, wondering how the hell we got between you and your mouse hole, or swaggering at us with your fright mask and your Halloween screeching, it doesn't mean shit to us. We're coming in for the kill. I dive directly at Hillebrand's head as it skitters towards me on its nightmare legs, and I drive my knife in through the eye at an upward angle into the brain, like a cross between a transorbital lobotomy and a bullet to the head. I feel it die around the blade, feel all that rage and energy, all that sound and fury simply cease to be. The multiplying limbs cascading fleshy horrors of a moment before are suddenly motionless and pale, just abandoned spook show decorations, frighten us from a derelict ghost train. Within seconds, they're drying out like dead vegetation, desiccated and fragile, snapping like dead twigs beneath Mr. James's tread as he crosses the kitchen floor to me. He brushes a few of them off his jacket and pulls one or two from my hair before slipping his arms around my waist. Still no sound of that damn Singapore sling, I say, patting his cheek. Would you be a darling? I need to find the vanity. I think I may have broken a nail. He's barely located the gin before we both hear the buzzing in his jacket pocket. Mr. James takes a quick look at the text message on his pager and then shows it to me. I feel a small tingle of excitement. Though I have no idea what temporal anomaly Carnegie Hall may turn out to mean, I have a pleasant sense that the day has not yet ceased to prove interesting. Mr. James smiles. I'll have Travis bring the car round, he says. I take the drink to go.
Hi, I'm Alison Moore, and the story I'm going to read for Midsummer Macabre began life as Vegas on Sea, but by the time I'd finished making it sinister, it was named Eastmouth. It was first published in 2014 in the Spectral Book of Horror Stories, edited by Mark Morris, and the following year it was included in Best British Horror, edited by Johnny Mains, and Best British Short Stories, edited by Nicholas Royal. So here's my summary seaside story, Eastmouth. Sonia stands on the slabs of the promenade, looking out across the pebbly beach. It is like so many of the seaside resorts from her childhood. She remembers one whose tarred pebbles left their sticky blackness on her bare feet and legs and the seat of her swimsuit. She had to be scrubbed red raw in the bath at the B&B. Her hands are wrapped around the railings, whose old paint is flaking off. When she lets go, her palms will smell of rust. The visibility is poor. She can't see land beyond Eastmouth. I've missed the sound of the gulls, says Peter, watching them circling overhead. He says this, thinks Sonia, as if he has not heard them for years, but during the time they've been at university, he got the train home most weekends. Sonia does not think she would have missed the gulls. She is used to the Midlands and to city life. She lets go of the railings and they walk on down the promenade. Sonia, in a thin, brightly coloured jacket, has dressed for warmer weather. Shivering, she huddles into herself. Let's get you home, says Peter. For the last half hour of their journey, while the train was pulling in, and all the way from the station, he's been saying things like that. We're almost home, and won't it be nice to be home? As if this were her home too. Their suitcases, pulled on wheels behind them, are noisy on the crooked slabs. They'll know we're here, says Peter. Who will? asks Sonia. Everyone, says Peter. Sonia, looking around, sees a lone figure in the bay window of a retirement home, and a woman in a transparent mac sitting on a bench in a shelter. Peter nods at the woman as they pass. It's quiet, says Sonia. It's quiet most of the year, says Peter. He points out a modernist pre-war building just ahead of them. I've always loved coming to see the shows, he says. My all-time favourite act is Cannon and Ball. Reaching this seafront pavilion, they stop to look at the posters. Look, says Peter, cannon and ball. He is beaming, cheerful, when he says, nothing changes. Peter lets them into the house with a key that he wears on a chain around his neck. His mother comes into the hallway with her arms wide open, saying to Sonia as much as to Peter, "You're home." Taking Sonia's jacket, looking at its bright colours, she says to Sonia, blue and green should never be seen, and then she puts the jacket away. As they sit down to dinner, Peter's mother says, "Sonia, what were you planning to do with your summer?" "I've applied for a job up north," says Sonia. "I had the interview yesterday, and I think it went well. I should hear tomorrow whether or not I've got it. I gave them this number. Peter said that was all right. If I get the job, I'll save up for a while, and then I want to go to Las Vegas." She mentions pictures she's seen of the place, all the lights. "If you like that sort of thing," says Peter's father, "you should take an evening stroll along our prom. You'll see it all lit up." He chews his food for a while before saying, "It's a lot hotter there, though. It wouldn't suit me. We stick to England, the south coast." A gust rattles the window, and Sonia turns to see the wind stripping the last of the leaves from a potted shrub in the backyard. "Look," says Peter's father, "the sun's coming out for you," and he nods towards a patch of sunlight the colour of weak urine on a whitewashed breeze-block wall. Peter's mother opens the wine and says to Sonia, "You'll be needing this." Sonia supposes she is referring to their long train journey, or perhaps the cold weather. It isn't clear. "It's nice to have you home," says Peter's mother, later, when they are clearing the table. "I think Peter's glad to be home," says Sonia. "And what about you?" "I don't live here," says Sonia. She is surprised that Peter's mother does not know this. "You didn't grow up here," agrees Peter's mother. Opening the back door, she throws the scraps into the yard, and the seagulls appear out of nowhere, descending instantly, filling the yard with their shrieks. "Our home is your home," she says, as she closes the door. "But I do remember what it's like to be young and independent. There are lots of empty flats around here, and they always need people at the pavilion. The place is crying out for young blood." "I wasn't planning on staying long," says Sonia. Peter's mother nods. She looks around the kitchen and says, "Well, I think that will do. I'll go and change the sheets on your bed." Their bags are side by side in the corner of Peter's bedroom. Hers has a sticker on the side saying, "I heart Las Vegas," even though she has never been there. His has a label giving his name, Peter Webster, and his home address, his parents' address, so that it can't get lost. They go to bed early, but Sonia lies awake in the darkness, in between the cold wall and Peter, who is fast asleep. She finally drops off in the early hours, before being woken at dawn by what she thinks is the sound of babies crying, but it is only the gulls. She finds the noise depressing. Sonia, in the bathroom, doing up the belt of her jeans, can hear Peter's mother talking on the phone at the bottom of the stairs. "No," she is saying, "I don't want it. I've changed my mind. Please don't call here again." Sonia checks her face in the mirror before coming out, finding Peter's mother on the landing now, outside the bathroom door. "All right, dear," says Peter's mother. "Come down to breakfast. I've made pancakes with syrup, just like they have in America." Sonia stays in all day. At the end of the afternoon, at 10 to 5, she phones the company she had hoped would call to offer her a job. She speaks to a receptionist, who says, "Please hold." Then she speaks to a secretary, who tells her that the job has been offered to someone else. The secretary sounds impatient and terminates the conversation as soon as she can. Sonia redials. She has some questions to ask, but no one picks up. They've all gone home. When Sonia goes up to bed that night, she finds that the sticker on her bag has been doctored with a permanent marker. Las has been neatly changed to East, but Vegas required a heavier hand, a thicker line. I heart Eastmouth. The following day is Saturday. After breakfast, Sonia watches the dead-eyed gulls gathering on the wall of the yard. They grab at the scraps Peter's mother puts out, and if the door is not kept closed, they will come inside, wanting the cat food, taking more than they have been given. "I think I'll go for a walk," says Sonia. "I'll come with you," says Peter, beginning to get to his feet. "I'd rather go on my own," says Sonia. Mr. and Mrs. Webster stop what they are doing and look at her. They watch her as she leaves the room. She puts on her shoes and looks for her jacket, but she can't find it. She asks Peter's mother if she's seen it, and Peter's mother says, "I'm washing it, wear mine." She takes down a heavy beige coat and helps Sonia into it. "Yours was too thin anyway," says Peter's mother. "You'll need something warmer now you're here." Sonia walks a mile along the promenade before coming to a stop, leaning on the railings and looking out to sea, watching a yellow helicopter that is circling in the distance. As a child, she used to wave to rescue helicopters, even though she knew they weren't really looking for her. It was just for fun or for practice. She raises her hands now and waves, scissoring her arms above her head like semaphore, as if she were someone in a high-vis jacket on a runway, although she does not know semaphore. She does not know how to say stop. The helicopter turns away and leaves. "Sonia!" She turns around and finds Peter's parents standing behind her. "We thought we'd walk with you," says Peter's mother. "What a good idea, a little leg stretch." They walk along with her, nodding to the woman in the transparent mac as they pass the shelter. When they reach the end of the promenade, Peter's father says, "We should turn back," and as they walk Sonia home again, they tell her about the evening's entertainment, a show at the pavilion and dinner at the Grand. "I've booked you a table," says Peter's father. "It's a fine place. It's where I proposed to Peter's mother. We go there every year for our anniversary." "Have the seafood platter," says Peter's mother. Peter, wearing one of his father's ties, walks Sonia along the blustery promenade. The seafront is all lit up with light bulbs strung between the lampposts. "See," says Peter, "who needs Las Vegas?" At the pavilion they see an Elvis. Sonia finds him disappointing. When the show is over, they go on to the Grand. They are greeted as Mr. and Mrs. Webster, and Sonia opens her mouth to correct the misapprehension, but they are already being led through the restaurant towards their table in the corner, and in the end she says nothing. When the waiter comes to take their order, Sonia asks for a pasta dish. "Are you not going to have the seafood platter?" asks Peter. "I don't think so," says Sonia. Peter looks concerned. He orders his own meal without looking at the menu. Sonia, looking around at the decor, says to Peter, "I doubt they've changed a thing since your parents first came here." Peter touches the flock wallpaper and says, "That's a nice thought." The waiter returns to light their candle and pour the wine. They raise their glasses, touching the thin rims together. Sonia brings hers close to her mouth, but barely wets her lips before putting it down again. "All right," says Peter. Sonia nods. She has not yet told him about the test she did in his parents' bathroom, about the white plastic stick with the little window in the middle, the vertical line that proved the test was working, and the sky blue, sea blue flat line that made her think of a distant horizon seen through an aeroplane window. She has not told him that when she came out of the bathroom with the plastic stick still in her hand, Peter's mother was standing there, and that when, after breakfast, she looked for the stick, it had been moved. The waiter returns with their meals. Peter, smiling down at the food on his plate, picking up his fork, begins to talk to Sonia about the possibility of a management position at the pavilion. His dad, he says, can pull a few strings. The waiter is coming back already. He is going to ask them if everything is all right, and Sonia is going to say yes, even though she has barely had a taste yet. Peter is holding his fork out across the table towards Sonia, offering her a piece of something whose fishy smell reminds her of the stony beach, the tarry pebbles, and the gulls that will wake her at dawn. She sees, in the molten wax around the wick of the candle, an insect. Sonia picks up her fork, aiming the handle into this hot moat. She is an air-sea rescue unit, arriving on the scene to lift the insect to safety. Carefully, she places the insect on a serviette to recover, as if it has only been floating in a sticky drink. "I think that one's had it," says Peter, and Sonia looks at it and thinks he might be right. Peter, who had the whole bottle of wine to himself, is still sleeping the next morning when Sonia gets up, puts on the beige coat, and lets herself out of the house. She walks down the promenade again, away from Peter's parents' house, heading in the direction she and Peter came from when they arrived here. She goes as far as the end of the promenade, where she stops to watch the gulls. And then she goes further, climbing up above the town until she is standing 100 metres above sea level in the wind. She is still in Eastmouth, though. She cannot see across to the next town. When she looks at her watch, she realises that she has been gone for a while now. As she makes her way down from the cliffs, she hears the tolling of a bell. It is coming from the church that stands on top of one of the hills that surround the otherwise flat town. On the promenade, all the shelters are empty. All the bay windows of all the retirement homes are empty. She realises that it's Sunday and wonders if everyone's at church. Peter's parents might be there, and perhaps even Peter. She veers slightly away from the promenade now. It is the start of the summer and ought to be warmer, but it is windy and cold, and she is glad of Peter's mother's coat. She has her purse in the pocket. She heads down a side street that brings her out at the train station, which is overlooked by the church. Alone on the platform, she stands in front of the train timetable. She looks at her watch, although pointlessly, as it turns out, because when she consults the timetable, she finds that no trains run on Sundays. She wanders to the edge of the platform and looks along the tracks in the direction she would go to get home, and then in the opposite direction. Is there really nothing at all on a Sunday, she wonders? Does nothing even pass through? She is still there when she notices that the woman in the transparent Mac is now standing at one end of the platform. She is talking on a mobile phone, but she is looking at Sonia, and so Sonia nods at her. She doesn't know whether she has been recognised. The woman, putting away the phone, approaches. When she is within touching distance, she says, "You're the Webster's girl." "No," says Sonia, preparing to introduce herself, whilst at the same time noticing the locals coming down the hill, coming from church. The service is over. It seems as if the whole town is heading towards them, like an army in beige and lilac. "Yes," says the woman, "you are. You're the Webster's girl." The crowd is nearing the foot of the hill. They are close now, and one by one they look at the woman in the transparent Mac, and they nod. Thank you.
At the turn of a century, I discovered the Suffolk landscape, and it began to inspire and influence my writing. If it had been good enough for M.R. James, then it was certainly good enough for me. Around that time, my stories were also becoming more of an enigma to me during the writing, and I was less concerned with understanding them than allowing them to become what they would. Wrong Side of the Tracks was such one that baffled me for a long time, until I had an illuminating conversation with a reader who'd seen things in it that I'd never realised were there, and it grew on me since then. It was also Peter James's favourite, and he singled it out for a good deal of praise in the introduction to the book, where it first appeared, my second collection, Ghosts Far From Subtle. Suffolk started to move past the windows as Hudson settled into his seat. He glanced out the window of the train and tried to slow his breathing. Traffic had been bad. He'd almost missed the train. Added to that fact, he'd woken late thanks to old batteries in his alarm clock, and Marjorie had just slumbered on relentlessly, even when he'd kneed her in the ribs whilst clambering over her sprawled body. His body felt coated in sweat beneath his suit and overcoat. Though the early morning skies were grey as slate and carried, as they had done for the better part of the last fortnight, the threat of rain, it was unbearably hot. Once he got to the office he could relax, remove his coat and jacket, unbutton his collar, roll up his sleeves, and then it would be on with the day's work. He looked back along the carriage at the scattered faces, some vaguely familiar from his weekday journeys, others less so. All looked bleary-eyed and dazed, and he lingered least on those faces that stared back at him. The town where he lived was dragged reluctantly away as the train gathered speed and headed into the countryside, factories and warehouses dotting the landscape, revealing the occasional promise of open fields and farmland. Hudson felt a little better now, and last night's argument with his wife had almost slipped completely from his mind. It was his fault, of course. Marjorie was a dear and always had been. He glanced at his vague, ghostly reflection in the glass as the train sped into the darkness of a tunnel, its horn bellowing a warning. His eyes looked heavily bagged as though sleeping in hammocks of wrinkled flesh, his jowls heavy behind his greying beard, and his hairline receded to the point where he was now referred to by most as a bald person. He was getting old, and he was feeling grouchy, and it was as simple as that. Hudson reflected upon his life, how his boyhood dreams had been put off year after year, and how he was now much too old to even consider living them out. The things he'd always wanted to do and the places that he'd always wanted to go had been left behind, like the fields that the train cut across, out of reach. No going back. He glanced up as somebody walked slowly along the carriage, a tall man dressed in a black overcoat, but his head was down to the floor, so Hudson didn't give him a second thought. He'd order some flowers to be delivered to the house, roses, a dozen red roses for his English rose. He smiled, watched his face crumple in the glass, and then turned away from it. The stranger in the black overcoat was looking straight at him, having settled into a seat facing the opposite direction. His face was long and gaunt and topped with sleek grey hair. He had a hooked nose lending him a predatory air, and a cruel, thin-lipped mouth. His eyes looked black as his clothes, and as Hudson stared, the stranger raised his head in acknowledgement and smiled. Flustered, Hudson twitched a half-smile in reply before turning away. The countryside seemed flat and endless, various shades of yellows, browns and greens. He closed his eyes, and then they opened again, for he had seen something other than the colour of fields out there. Somebody was running across the fields towards the tracks, arms flailing as though trying to attract attention. Corn waved like the sea all around the fleeing figure, and before distance made it impossible to see any more, Hudson realised that the person was being pursued, or at least followed, for something was rushing up fast behind them through the corn. He thought no more about it for the rest of the day. He sat at his desk in the badly air-conditioned office, scratching at his neck, which felt irritated by his shirt collar, until people stared at him. Several times he stomped off to the water fountain down the corridor and told himself off for his increasingly bad mood and brusque manners. His hand hovered over the payphone in the corridor as the number of a shop where Marjorie worked trooped through his head, but every time he tried to think of what he would say when she answered, he just saw his mouth flapping like a fish out of water. On the train home, he read the evening news, keeping his face down despite the feeling that he was being watched. Whenever the train pulled into a station, He would raise his head and quickly glance around the carriage, but if anyone was watching him, then they were well concealed in the crowded train. Marjorie had made a lovely dinner for them both as a thank you for the flowers which were proudly displayed in her best crystal vase in the centre of a dining table. Sam was asleep in bed, having worn himself out at the school sports day. Hudson crept into the boy's room and pecked him a quick kiss before going back down to dinner. As he chewed through his steak, Marjorie's eyes twinkled at him, and he couldn't help but smile at her in return. Afterwards, they listened to Mozart in the lounge, and he felt relaxed enough to tell her how much he loved her, had always loved her. It was a good life, he thought, as they drifted off to sleep after making love for the first time in a few weeks, and he didn't want to lose any of this. He was waiting for the train the following Monday with plenty of time to spare, and thinking back over the most pleasant weekend he'd had in recent memory. A trip to the theatre to see a play that was so plagued by mistakes they'd howled with laughter. Taking Sam out to a park on Sunday where Hudson had almost been able to forget his age and waistline and run around and kick a ball until the heat had chased him to a table outside a nearby pub where he and Marjorie had drunk themselves docile and Sam had drifted off to sleep, curled up on the bench as the day turned darker. The train groaned alongside the platform and Hudson stepped into the nearest carriage. When he noticed the stranger in the black overcoat staring at him with dark and piercing eyes, he smiled back for a moment until a feeling reached him like somebody had poured a bucket of ice down the back of his shirt. Suddenly, he recognised the man from last week, and he got the feeling that the man recognised him just as well. Hudson glanced down at his knees, the briefcase pressed between them like the filling of an unappetising sandwich. Why he should feel bothered about a fellow passenger recognising him, he wasn't sure, but he just didn't care for the look of the man. At the next station, more early morning travellers pushed on, and through the newcomers it was hard to see the tall stranger, at least until he stood up, his head ducked low to avoid the ceiling, and stalked his way towards the rear of a carriage. Of course, the train wasn't about to stop. The man must want to use the WC. Hudson flushed red, feeling embarrassed at the realisation. He imagined the gaunt figure folded into the tiny lavatory, but instead of being laughably ridiculous, the image just seemed disturbing. He imagined the other like a long-legged spider crouched in its lair, waiting for prey to walk past outside the door. As if to taunt him, Hudson's bladder twinged, and he held it in uncomfortably all the way to the office. Because of that, he started off his working week in yet another bad mood, and this only served to annoy him more and more. As the day wore on, circumstance did little to enlighten him. Storm clouds, pregnant with rain, brought a premature darkness to his homeward journey. He watched his reflection grow glummer with each passing mile, until the expression looked as though it wanted to slide off his face. Though he had the feeling that somebody was staring right at him, he couldn't bring himself to look. At his station, he thought that he was being followed in the subway onto the street, but when he turned and looked and saw the long tiled corridor was empty, he thought it must have only been an echo. He drove home and went straight to bed, where he lay gazing at the ceiling for most of the night, pretending to doze whenever Marjorie woke and turned towards him. Perhaps a holiday was what he needed to destroy this feeling that he was sinking deeper and deeper into a prison of his own foul moods. On his lunch hour the next day, he prowled up and down the high street, standing outside the windows of travel agents until he felt self-conscious enough to be driven inside and pile his arms with thick, glossy brochures. He returned to the office and shoveled them into his briefcase, and the thought of flipping through them on a train home made the day seem to go quicker. The gaunt stranger smirked at him, as soon as he stepped onto the train. Hudson turned, but this was the last carriage, and it would look as though he were fleeing if he walked the length of it to step through into another one. Instead, he sat down where he was, putting some distance and a handful of other people between them. He ducked his head behind the seat so that the stranger couldn't see his every movement, and pulled out a handful of the holiday brochures. Greece beckoned with its tiny islands and blue waters. Italy invited him with rolling brown hills and sun-soaked villages. He rested his head and closed his eyes, recalling the last times he'd been to both of them. Happier days, when he was younger and slimmer and more comfortable with the man that he had been then. When he opened his eyes, the stranger was pointing at him. Hudson scowled, then his head turned as the pointing finger changed direction and guided his eyes towards the window. Out in the early evening, fields rushed by. Shadows toned down their natural colours, but hadn't darkened them enough for him not to see the two figures dashing through the corn towards him. Immediately Hudson turned back to glower, but the man had risen on his stilt-like legs to walk off to wherever it was that he went to. By the time Hudson glanced back to the window, the figures had shrunk to insects, then to nothing. There was something not right about the scene, and particularly about the stranger directing his attention towards it. What the devil had the man meant by it? He thought back to the last time he'd witnessed the chase and how the stranger had been present then. Coincidence? It had to be, but yet it seemed something more than that. There was desperation in the fleeing figure and determination and purpose in that of the pursuer. Not to mention just that awful gut feeling that something wrong was taking place out there in the corn. It was still on his mind as he rushed through the subway and towards the car park. A homeless person had been lingering around the mouth of a subway, and the light above their head had been broken, dousing them in shadow. Cold, glimmering eyes watched Hudson pass, and only when he was safely locked into his car and driving home did his heart finally do anything less than pound against his chest. The house was filled with music as he locked the front door securely behind him. He was annoyed at Marjorie for not having locked it already. He checked the lock 3 times before hanging up his overcoat and jacket and walking on through to the lounge. Mozart was on the stereo and Marjorie was curled into the sofa with a glass of wine. She looked up at him with a smile. "Thank you for the flowers," she said. "What flowers?" Hudson asked, his body tense. He knew she wouldn't still be thanking him from last week. "The black roses. They were waiting for me on the doorstep when I got home." A chill washed over his body, and he could feel his hair standing on end. He had the vision of a doorstep, his doorstep, with the roses lying upon it, waiting for somebody to claim them. Again, he felt plagued by the feeling of something not quite right, but there had to be an innocent explanation. Already, Marjorie was curious. "You didn't send them, did you?" she asked, slithering into an upright position. Hudson felt his body drain of energy and he collapsed beside her, tugging at his collar like a man in a noose. The shadows seemed too thick, and the ones outside the window too eager to press themselves against the glass. It was no surprise that his sleep was restless and plagued by nightmares. He saw a tall and spindly figure as black as the night, stalking through endless fields of corn, plucking stalks of it from the ground and weaving them into a human figure in its skeletal hands. By the morning, he was determined to do something about the man on the train. He got to the station and waited on the platform with the others, a small assortment of bleary-eyed workers heading off into the city like himself. The sky was pale, as though bled of colour, but still tinged with darkness towards the horizon, or it dipped behind the factories as though the buildings were casting their shadows upon it. The train was 7 minutes late, and already annoyance had mixed in with his anger at the stranger, and the dreams and the flowers. As soon as he saw the man sitting just by the doors where Hudson stepped on, as though inviting him to take a seat, he felt unable to breathe. Thoughts of confrontation writhed in his mind as he stomped to the opposite end of a carriage. He would have gone through into the next one, but he knew that something had to be done. He just didn't know what, yet. He sat down and propped his briefcase on his lap like a shield. The train rumbled into life and began to gallop down the tracks, dragging the clouds in the sky along with it, but not the station or the town. Hudson stared out as the fields began to fill the window, then shut his eyes tight for fear of seeing an anonymous figure being pursued, then opened them again for fear of what might creep up on him when he wasn't looking. The stranger grinned across at him and nodded his skull-like head. Last week, hadn't he had swept-back silver hair? This week he had none. His skull looked lumpy and patched like the moon. He looked as though he'd aged 10 years in so many days. Hudson shuddered and turned away before the other man could point at anything he wouldn't want to see. There was something wrong with him. Of course there was. One only had to look at the man to see that. He glanced down at his watch and urged time onwards. Perhaps he could think it over at the office, and then if he saw the man again he could take action, and if he didn't then no action would be needed. He thought again of the flowers somebody had left for Marjorie. Roses. Fields swam by outside the window, but he wouldn't let his attention be drawn by any movement out there, just farm workers, he told himself, or blackbirds, or anything, I don't care. When his stop came, he was dreading the stranger rising up on those spider-like legs of his and stalking after him, clutching some corn effigy in his hands. Ridiculous. Ridiculous, of course it was, but the vision urged him onwards, and when he was on the platform, he rushed forwards towards a barrier where there were other people before turning to look back at the train. The man was still on it. Hudson could see his gaunt profile clearly through the glass. He was alone in the carriage. In fact, the train now had only a few passengers, being almost the end of the line. As Hudson watched, the train began to pull out, and the stranger turned his head and raised a hand with unnaturally long fingers to wave. Surely it had only been sunlight reflected upon the glass, and not something made of corn that the other had clutched in his hand? But of course it was still early morning, and the sun wasn't yet high enough to peer over the top of the station behind him. Hudson turned and hurried through the station, as though it were a portal back to reality, and into the reassuring noise of a city. All that morning at the office he felt on edge, as though waiting for something. When Rushton came in from his lunch break, he finally realised what it must have been. "Did you hear about the train crash?" he asked. And Hudson didn't need telling which train it had been. He listened, blank-faced and silent, whilst his colleagues discussed the news. Yes, it had been the same train. Gone off the rails just after pulling out of the city, crashed into an old abandoned rail warehouse and exploded. No survivors found. Despite the tragedy, Hudson immediately saw the silver lining and didn't feel too guilty about it. No survivors meant that the stranger was dead. It could have been me. The words played over and over again in his mind all day long and in the expensive taxi ride home that evening. Marjorie hadn't even heard yet and was shocked to tears when he explained. Hudson felt almost like laughing out loud, but it was an undoubted tragedy. There had still been innocent people upon that train, and the stranger himself, however ill, surely hadn't deserved to die in so horrendous a fashion. He couldn't sleep that night and didn't go into work the following day. He began to pray for the first time since he'd married aimlessly. He just prayed and hoped that it would help. When eventually he bullied himself into going back to work, Marjorie protested with her silence. Ever since the day of the accident, she'd been acting funny, and still every time he looked at her, he was unable to get the anonymous flowers out of his mind. Had he ever really considered the possibility that a stranger upon the train had left them for her? He had, he knew, but he'd been stupid. Maybe there was somebody else, somebody she worked with, or who used the shop, or... He watched her from the corner of his eye, unable to ask, and froze every time he saw her with Sam. He waited patiently upon the platform in the rain, his heart pounding. There were only two others waiting with him, and their features looked washed away either by the rain or by his lack of sleep. Maybe the accident had scared others away too. There was a low rumble, then a grating shriek, and the train pulled into sight and sidled against the platform. Hudson trotted on board, missing the rush of bodies, the feeling of liveliness. The train crash had seemed to bleed the summer of all life and washed away most of his anger towards himself and his life. He felt like a clockwork toy that was winding down, ready to be put away. He glanced along the carriage, but no dark stranger sat staring at him, ready to point or rise and stalk. For the next 10 minutes, he studied the back of a seat opposite until he started to feel that his whole life had been lived amongst the blue and red woven threads. Here, a cigarette burn was a volcano upon his landscape. A threadbare patch was a derelict corner of his world, a sad place where he could go with his memories. Here he was alone, not a married man, not a family man, not a father, just him, even a man without a name. He wondered what Marjorie would think if he never came home, and for how long Sam would cry, but let the idle thoughts drift like litter on a breeze. He felt weariness tugging his eyelids shut, and darkness washed over him. His eyes snapped open as he realised that it hadn't been the dark embrace of sleep. Somebody tall and dressed in black had passed him. He turned stiffly to see the stranger stepping through the end door of a carriage. There was no doubt about it. It was him. Ridiculous, Hudson protested to himself. He's dead. I saw him on the train, and the train crashed after I saw him. It can't be. But already he was eager to be off the train and had risen on legs which felt weak as spaghetti and staggered in the opposite direction, to be ready to lurch from the train as soon as it stopped. Rain smeared the fields beyond the glass as grey as the city pavements. His eyes flickered back along the carriage every few seconds to make sure the tall stranger wasn't heading towards him and couldn't trap him here in the end carriage with nowhere to go. By the time the train stopped, his heart was beating unbearably. He had to get help, he thought, hoping but not caring that there might be a refreshment area at this platform where he could sit and drink tea until he recovered. He couldn't take much more of this. But the platform, when the doors hissed open, was little more than that. A bench was sheltered, but the shelter stank of damp earth and worse, and a set of steps led down to a road between cornfields. He spilled out onto the concrete and bustled down the steps, almost falling over his own weak legs. Once on the road, he headed off up it, striding with as much power and determination as he could muster. The train was still at the station. He tried not to think why that might be as he walked, and then realised if the stranger was getting off after him, he would be a sitting duck out here in the middle of a road. Before he knew what he was doing, Hudson stepped off the road and began to march through the high corn. All around him it whispered like the sea. He marched briskly, not looking back, heading off in roughly a parallel direction to where the road had been leading. Sooner or later he would come to a village, and then he would be safe. Safe from what? What was happening to him? He couldn't honestly say. A stranger on a train? A man who should be dead? A ghost? His own life? His own fears? He marched as though trying to outpace his thoughts. When he noticed that his hands were reaching up around his neck and tugging off his tie, he blamed it on the stifling heat. But he couldn't say why he then cast off his overcoat, his jacket, his briefcase was long gone. Where, he didn't know. His fingers fumbled at his shirt buttons. Thunder rumbled and the dark grey skies began to unleash more rain. The train had pulled out of the station at last, and now, half naked and losing his mind, he was running towards it through the corn, because he'd realised something. He didn't want to lose Marjorie and Sam after all. They were his world, his reason for living. Whether there really was something rushing through the corn behind him, or whether it was just the breeze, didn't matter, and he wasn't going to stop running or even look back. Because there would be somebody sat on that train right now, looking out through the rain-smeared glass at him. And he didn't dare to think what might be heading back home to Marjorie and Sam that evening, in his place.
Hi, I'm Tim Lebbon, and I'm really pleased to be here reading a story for you for Midsummer Macabre. My initial plan was to be sitting on top of a lovely Welsh mountain in t-shirt and shorts with a flask of coffee next to me reading you a story. Unfortunately, it's freezing outside and I'm not going to put myself through that. So instead, you've got me in my office. I hope that's okay. The story I'm going to read is called Searching for the Room You Can Never Find. It's an original story that I wrote for my recent brand new collection from PS Publishing called All Nightmare Long. This story was partly inspired by a really strange convention I went to. It wasn't a strange convention. I think it was World Horror or StokerCon in New York. It was one or the other. I'd sort of lose track a little bit of all these conventions. After a few drinks, one night I decided to go back to my room and found my way squiffily but not drunkenly along a hotel corridor. Right floor, right door number, right room number. And I got my electric key and started trying to slot it in, and it just wasn't working. It was a bit strange. So I went down to reception, found my way back down to reception, and they said, "Oh yeah, you've been trying to get into our shadow hotel. It's been upgraded. You need to go up that staircase." So that was a bit weird. So I went up the staircase they sent me to, found my floor, found my room, got in. It just always stuck with me, this idea that this hotel had a shadow hotel almost attached to the back of it. with same room numbers, just a bit more dilapidated and run down. It's sort of a spooky idea, really, especially after a few glasses of whiskey. So I'm going to read this story for you. It's called Searching for the Room You Can Never Find. It's sort of I won't even try and describe it. It's one of those stories I wrote. My work's getting a bit gentler, I guess, but a bit more contemplative. Maybe that's age. Who knows? Or the world we live in. So here we go. Searching for the room you can never find. The door scrapes on grit, something that has been dropped and smashed, and it sounds so much like an angry growl close to my ear that I jump and glance behind me, out across the desolate, dust-covered gardens where my footprints to this place are already fading away. It's the gentle breeze that does that, the fine dust. The breath of the world wipes out any trace that I've ever been there. The scraping is the loudest sound I've heard in days, maybe even weeks, and I freeze in place. I imagine the sound echoing away through this vast old mountain hotel and wonder what it might make. But that is only fanciful make-believe. In reality, I know there's nothing and no one there, or anywhere, only dust. Inside, I turn and stare at the large front doors for so long that the hazy sun has moved across the light brown sky by the time I come to my senses. The light has changed and shifted, but it's difficult to tell how much time has passed. I decide to leave the door as it is. I can't bear that noise again, and I can now see that the door ground across the shattered remains of something that might once have been fine china or bone. It doesn't really matter that it will remain open. Quick escape, I think, but that's an idea from many months ago, not now. Back then there had been things I needed to consider escaping from quickly. I turn and head into the large lobby area. It's illuminated by 6 huge hanging chandeliers, each holding 24 clear glowing bulbs. It's curious that the power's still on, but I don't dwell on it for too long, because this is a whole new world of mysteries. 3 weeks ago I saw a car sitting on flat tyres with its engine still running. There's a spread of tan leather sofas to my left and a long reception desk to the right, with large columns holding up the 3-story roof, mirrors and paintings reflecting what the gorgeous landscape beyond the windows and doors had once looked like. It's nice to see these paintings, and sad too. It's like looking into my dreams, framed by the limit of recollection. On some of the low tables between the leather sofas, large vases hold the brittle remains of flowers. Petals of fine dried sculptures on the tabletops, waiting for a breath to reduce them to dust. A stack of luggage is piled close to the reception desk, with a laptop bag left carelessly open on top. A trolley stands nearby, empty but for a folded pushchair. On a single lonely chair placed against one of the columns, a book is open face down. I see the title, and it's one I've always thought I should read, but I don't pick it up just yet. There's a fine sheen of dust across everything, just enough to dull the whole scene. I don't mind. Most of what I see now is like this. And that's fine, because there's a place where it isn't so. I've been travelling for some time, so I decided to go and find this place before thinking about anything else. The food I might discover here, the water, the booze, the clothing and blankets and tools, and anything else that might help me to continue in this strange new world. Before all of that, I go to rediscover the past. Room 104. Alice tripped as she came to sit back down, as she giggled as she went sprawling, left hand sinking into the sand, knees thumping onto the blanket. And despite everything, she retained hold of the wine glass in her left hand. Didn't spill a drop, she said, and her giggle turned into a guffaw that ended in a loud snort. From along the beach, another couple who'd come to watch the sunset applauded, and the woman let out a supported whoop. And Alice raised a glass to them and said, "I thank you." I helped her sit, hugging her close. "Water's freezing," she said, even though she'd only gone in up to her shins. I remained seated on the blanket, nursing a beer in one hand and content to watch her paddling. I'd managed to take a few sly photos with my phone, even though she didn't like having a picture taken. I never really figured that out or understood. I told her she was beautiful, to which she only shrugged. "Sun's going down," I said, stating the obvious. It seemed to settle the moment, and Alice leaned into me, nestling her head on my shoulder. I hugged her close and brought the second blanket up over our legs. The waves shushed up against the shore. A dog barked in the distance, so far along the beach that I could hardly see it against the sand. A few seagulls still whirled overhead, ready to roost. "Do they just float?" I asked. "Huh? The seagulls. Do they float around on the sea at night? Roost on the cliffs or rooftops? Where do they go? Seagull Hotel, she said, sipping some more wine. Turn your brain off. Look. She was right. Nothing needed to be said. We sat close to each other and watched as the sun burned its way into the sea, setting the water aflame and bleeding its last across the cloudy skies. The colours started bright and then turned deep, like an oil painting being sketched, layered, and then given depth by an invisible, impatient artist. Darkness fell quickly. Soon we'd finished our drinks. The other couple walked past us hand in hand towards the paths leading through the dunes and back into town. We stayed, though, and neither of us needed to say why. Some moments that should last forever just seem to play out that way. I wake after several hours' sleep. The bed's in the most comfortable I've slept in, perhaps ever. I'm alone, even though for a while I feel sand between my toes and smell Alice's hair. That brand of shampoo that simply says Alice, however autumnal, woodland or spring flowers it claims to be. Soon those sense memories bleed away like a sunset, and I sit up against the headboard. It's night outside now, but the lights are still on, and I see myself reflected in a dark window. I need a shower, and I've already established that the hotel has running water. As far as I can tell, it has everything that makes it a hotel, apart from staff and guests. I don't know how long it's been since I've had a proper wash. To begin with, I was keeping count of the days, and then the weeks. But once I lost track, it was difficult to grab hold of them again, and more time dashed past with every blink. I stare into my own exhausted eyes and lean back down into the pillow, but sleep does not come. Later, I hear faint voices in the distance, like poor radio reception or a stilted conversation. Perhaps they belong to people back on that faraway beach, and they're just an echo from my dream. Or maybe they're ghosts. Either way, I don't go to investigate, because I'm sure they're best left alone. When morning comes, I have that shower. It's delightful. The gel smells of pine forests not covered in dust, and I stand beneath the powerful spray until the water swirling down the plug hole turns from brown to clear. It feels strange being so clean, and when I look at the filthy clothes scattered on the bathroom floor, I can't face putting them back on. There's a fluffy, heavy robe hanging behind the door, and I slip it on while I'm still wet and go looking for something to eat. I've been lost in hotels before, especially at night after a few drinks. Once in New York, I found myself in a shadow hotel, corridors slightly more run down than I was used to seeing, doors speckled with damp, and when I found my room number, the key wouldn't fit. I tried for a time, but the door was not opening. I checked the room number and tried again and again. Eventually, I found my way down to reception, and the receptionist smiled and said I'd found my way into the other hotel, the one not taking guests anymore, and she directed me to my own room. I woke up next day doubting the memory, and I doubt it even now. I wander the huge building with no receptionist to ask the way. It's half an hour or more before I find my way to a large dining room, imbued with the memory of old breakfasts. I walk through the kitchens and the larders, and there I find shelves and the shelves of tinned food, and in the large walk-in fridge there's bacon and sausages and more food than I can ever eat. I cook on gas rather than open fire for the first time in forever, and the food tastes glorious. I eat it at a table in the edge of the dining room. Several times I raise my hand and chuckle as I imagine a waiter or waitress walking over to top up my coffee. I finish the mug, feeling as though I've drunk 2 or 3, and leave the plates to clean up later. It already feels like it's been a long day. I'm tired again, probably from my long search for the dining room, cooking and eating such a good, rich food. Still in my robe, I stroll out of the large dining hall and past the staircase. I turn and look up at no one coming down. I venture up the stairs. The corridor on the first floor is identical to the one below, with the same patterned carpet, checkered colour scheme and subtle light fittings. Between blinks it's pristine and dust-coated. It reminds me of that long-ago hotel with its shadow self. Every door's closed, but they all have old-fashioned keys in their locks, with heavy wooden fobs engraved with room numbers. I wonder why any hotel would have been left with keys in open doors. Maybe it's simply waiting for me. I choose a door at random, and inside I immediately feel at home. The room's familiar, as if I've only just left it. Even though it's a bland and sterile and clean, it contains nothing of mine. The bed is huge. The covers are turned down, and there's a small wrapped chocolate on one of the pillows. It's in the shape of a small bird. I peel it and start chewing, and the taste accompanies me down. Room 134. Another beach and a different time. This one was in a small fishing village in Cornwall. We had a meal and shared a bottle of wine, and we went for a long walk before we went to bed. We were both relaxed but far from drunk, and we were the only people on the small sandy beach as far as I could tell. It was dark and breezy, and waves washed against nearby rocks, throwing up ghostly spray in the moonlight. There was nothing really special about the moment, no more than 1,000 others we'd spent together and would spend together in the future. Alice hugged me from behind, and we watched the sea together. "Food, baby," she said, tightening her arms a little around my stomach. I groaned. "Shouldn't have had that apple pie and custard." "Eyes bigger than your belly." I opened my eyes as wide as I could, and even though she couldn't see, I knew that she knew what I was doing. "I'm looking forward to growing old with you," I said. "Idiot." She sighed heavily into my neck, and we watched the sea ebb and flow up onto the beach and back down, a gentle heartbeat indifferent to our own, and yet so bound with that moment. When I wake, it's morning again. I stretch in the bed, sit up, and look at the once glorious views. The curtains are open, and I can't recall whether or not I closed them the night before. Beyond, the landscape's wide and huge and desolate, with mountains in the distance, valleys close by, the flat sheen of several lakes interrupting the rugged terrain. It's all grey. Dust has made this place its own. I cough as though it's still in my throat, even though the room is sealed and clear. I walk to the windows and run my hands around the edges, testing the seals. I tug at a handle and one casement pops open, and I shove gently until it reaches its limit. The familiar smell of my past few weeks or months is carried in on that constant, equally familiar breeze. I realise that I'm naked and the robe I've been wearing is on the floor. I go to the wardrobe and there are some clothes in there, trousers and socks and underwear and several shirts. They're tatty but clean, and they're just about my size. I decide that I have to take some control of my situation. I know there's plenty of food here and that the power is still on, but if I'm going to remain here for some time, and there's no doubt in my mind, and when I look at the colour-bleached landscape, it's as if I've always been here, I have to check out this huge hotel properly, see what else there is, and make sure I'm alone. It's a strange thought because I haven't seen another person in so long that I can't remember what their face looked like, nor the sound of their voice. All I can remember is Alice from my dreams, and how her hair felt against my cheek and the smell of her on my skin. And that's fine. If I'm to remember just one person, it's always going to be Alice. As I wash and use the bathroom, I hear the distant thump and rumble of water moving through pipes. I turn it off and step from the bathroom, and there's still a sound coming from somewhere. I think it's water hammer or perhaps a leak, but then it comes closer and easier to identify. Footsteps on soft carpet. I stare at the closed door and the narrow band of light below it, cast there by the corridor lights outside. No shadow interrupts the light, and the footsteps, if that's really the sound is, soon drift away. Perhaps whatever cast them is too nebulous to affect light, or maybe it was merely the sigh of fading waves. I spend some time walking the corridors of this strange, empty hotel. There's no sign that I'm anything other than alone. I peer into several other rooms and one of the larger suites, all empty and perfectly prepared for future guests. I check the ice machine close to the staircases, 2 machines to each floor, one in each of the 2 vast wings, and they're humming and chilled with chilled delight. The paper cup holders on each machine are full and untouched. I travel up and down in the elevators, examining myself in the mirrors that cast 1,000 images of me back and forth, as if seeking enough of me to fill all the rooms. I'm looking older than I remember, more drawn, my eyes not as bright as before, as if coated in dust. It's hardly a surprise. I've been out there in the ruined world for longer than I can recall, and I must have seen terrible things. I find the gym with sauna and jacuzzi, and there's even a small pool, nowhere near large enough to swim in, but still warm, rippling from 2 small vents on the pool floor. There are 8 loungers around the pool, each with a folded towel and robes, and one of those wrapped bird-shaped chocolates that I found on my pillow the previous evening. The restaurant is as I left it, one table strewn with yesterday's meal. The bar is large and relaxed with subdued lighting. Soft music is piped in from somewhere through speakers I can't find. The tunes are innocuous, written for background, and I don't recognise any of them. I find a computer room for guests. The computer's all on, but with no internet access. There's a small shop selling essentials and books and a counter of souvenirs from the area. Hidden down a corridor just past the shop is the laundry room. There's no sign of anyone else being here. No indication that anyone came here since the hotel staff and management left. It's as if the hotel has been left, ready for me. I take a dip in the pool, bobbing around for an hour or so before sitting in the sauna for a while. The jacuzzi is too violent after such gentleness, so I sit on one of the lounges instead, towel draped over my nakedness even though there's no one here to see. I drift off, then back again. I'm relaxed. Later I'll make another meal, this time steak and chips and mushroom. And as I follow up with apple pie and custard, I smile and think of Alice by the sea, and I hear the hush of waves washing onto a distant beach. It sets my eyes drooping. I had intended going to the bar for a nightcap, but I can do that tomorrow or the next day. I can do that whenever I want. Room 232. Alice was driving because I'd had a pint with lunch in a small country pub on the way to the hotel where we were going to spend a long weekend walking, eating, drinking, just being with each other. The roads were less busy now that we'd left the dual carriageway, and the route winding up into the hills revealed more and more of the glorious views all around. I felt bad because I could take them in, while Alice had to concentrate on the twisting road, the stone walls protecting us from sheer drops and the potholed surface. A bike race came from the opposite direction, and soon they were sweeping past us, heading downhill while our little car continued to climb. Their focus and effort impressed me. Sometimes it was single riders, while others rode in small groups. All of them showed the sweat and pain of the climb they just made up to the high pass where our hotel sat. And I wondered how many had glanced at that hotel and thought about stopping for a drink. "Maybe we can go for a ride," Alice said. "On our balcony?" I asked, wriggling my eyebrows, even though she was concentrating on the road. "You." She changed gear and we turned the corner, and the moment became special. Alice driving. Me relaxed in the passenger seat, her hands on the wheel, the way the light played across her skin as the car shifted direction, as if she was guiding the sun and conducting its rays. "Love you," I said, and she waited a while before saying it back. In that while, everything between us was calm and perfect. I knew she felt it as well, calm and perfect. The drive went on for another half an hour, but it was that moment that stuck with me, pinned to the memoryscape of our life together. Sometimes it happens like that. Most memories hang from bigger moments, but it's the smaller ones that hold no real import at the time that sometimes persist. Her voice when she returned, "Love you too." Her hands on the wheel steering the sun. Those forgotten moments that turn out to mean so much. I wake to the sound of people walking past my room. They're talking in low voices as if to not disturb me, and there's a whoosh, whoosh. There might be heavy feet dragging along the carpet, or perhaps the memory of bike wheels whisking past. I lie motionless in bed until they pass me by, though it's difficult to tell when silence falls again. I sit up in bed and look around my room. My room, I think, but that idea doesn't quite fit. I stayed in different rooms the previous 2 nights, and though they were both quite similar to this one, though not identical, because this is an upmarket place with different colour schemes and furnishings in each room, even though the corridors all appear to be the same. I know that they were elsewhere. I'm not even sure I can remember their numbers, but I'm equally certain that doesn't matter. I go to the door, looking through the fisheye and seeing nobody outside, touching my ear to the wood and hearing nothing. I probably imagined the noises as I rose up from sleep. Washed and dressed, I leave the room and head outside, closing the door behind me. I know I probably won't see inside that room again. There's something quite exciting about choosing a different room each night. It feels a little like exploring. I head along the corridor, searching for a staircase that will take me down to the ground floor and the dining room. I have a raging hunger every morning, which I don't recall from my time outside, beyond the comforts and safety of this huge, empty hotel. I pass by a painting on the wall and pause, backtrack and stare. It's a beautiful image of a bird, small with a red flash across its head and speckled brown wings that could never be called dull. I've never seen this bird before. Elsewhere in the hotel, probably, but somewhere else as well. I frown. It looks out of place. It's the first time I've thought that since I've been here. The painting style might be called old-fashioned, the sort of image that would have looked more at home in a quaint old pub in the countryside, whereas the rest of the hotel is decidedly modern. Some of the artwork I've seen is of the "I could have done that" sort. Alice and I had always argued about that in a good-natured way. Then why didn't you, she'd ask. I could most definitely not have painted this bird. I stepped back and it's almost lifelike, so much so that I half expected to turn its head towards me, then alight from the wall and flit off along the corridor. The bird remains motionless and I head off in search of breakfast. That afternoon I sit at the bar and drink good whiskey and cry a little, because I don't know where Alice is. I don't know where anyone is. And the front door I left open 3 days before is let in a haze of dust that has covered the entire reception area, dulling the paintings that hang there, all of which now seem to be of that red-crested bird. Excuse me. The whiskey goes down well enough, though, and after a few more tears, I'm happier. The bar remains empty, but I no longer feel alone. I wonder at all the people who've drunk here, breathed this air, and sat where I'm sitting. After another couple of whiskies, it's almost as if they're here with me. I hear chatter and laughter, and shadows start to move in my peripheral vision. Perhaps it's the dust-laden breeze drifting through from the reception area, but I like to think not. I raise a glass to them all and take another sip, and somehow, later, I find my way to bed. Room 352. Alice and I sat on our hotel room balcony. The view was beautiful. We were consumed by the glow of recent lovemaking, a relaxed heat, and we were both nursing a glass of red. We sat close together, arms touching. The sun was sinking towards the mountains and already spreading its colours across snow-speckled peaks. We were silent as we waited for it to dip beneath the horizon. We had no doubt that it would set the clouds afire in a staggering display all for us. Even before the bird came, I knew this was one of those special moments. Then the bird fluttered up from the garden and landed on the balcony's handrail. And Alice's slight gasp stuck in my memory, and I saw her tense from the corner of my eye as the bird sat there, head jerking left, right, as it checked us out. It had a red stripe across its head and speckled brown wings, a light chest with darker markings. "What is it?" I asked. "Never seen it before," she said. I tried to hold on to that moment, but it flew away with the bird. It was the last day I saw Alice alive. We spent the rest of that beautiful day together, and it was the longest, most profound, great moment I ever experienced. You know what I mean. These moments punctuate life, and often there's no real reason or cause why they stick in your mind. They're imbued with a sense that all is well, and always will be. Your heart is pure happiness, and they're perfect moments in a life that's otherwise, by necessity, imperfect. You breathe them in and give thanks, and then they're gone, and often it's difficult to remember the exact feeling, only that the feeling was there. That was it. That was my last time. That night during our sleep, we left each other, and I wake in another impersonal hotel room with a painting of that bird on the wall above the dressing table. And I cry because I know Alice has gone forever. Even though I've these perfect moments, she is gone. I find peace, however, when I spend the rest of that day walking the hotel. It's difficult to see how many floors there are and how many rooms there are on each, but I aim to visit every single one, until the dust from the open front doors sweeps in and dulls this place from my mind forever. And there's my story about searching for the room you can never find. I hope you enjoyed it. It's sort of a gentler piece, like I say, a lot of my work is right now. But it's sort of got its own little sense of power and mystery, I think. I quite like it. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoy the rest of Midsummer Macabre, which I hope the sun comes up soon because it's still freezing here. So yes, thank you very much. And thanks to Joe for inviting me in to be part of this. Cheers. Take care, everyone.
My name's David Moody. I write some pretty horrible stuff. My signature tagline is that I like to write about ordinary people and put them through absolute hell. They say a lot of the things that you write about are autobiographical, but I just wanted to put it out there before I start that nothing in this story is autobiographical at all. This in no way, shape or form is based on anything that's happened to me or anything or anybody I know. I have no idea where this horrible, sordid little tale came from, but I thought it'd be just the kind of thing that would be fun to share with you. So this is the deal. I must be out of my mind. I never thought it would come to this. I mean, I knew I was in trouble, that I had to do something, but this is like something out of one of those shitty made-for-TV crime movies. I'm 7 floors up in an otherwise empty high-rise that'll be rubble less than a month from now, and I don't know what the hell I'm doing here. The waiting is endless. All this space and silence gives me too much time to think. It isn't fair, you know, it's not my fault. It's just how I am. It's all about perspective, that's what I keep telling myself. What turns one person on might repulse another. You can't choose your kink, but by God, I wish you could. Maybe then I'd have found something that wasn't such a taboo, something that wasn't so likely to get me locked up. If she hadn't found out what I liked, then I wouldn't be in this fucking mess right now. She wouldn't have any hold over me, and I could have just kicked her out. And what pisses me off most of all is the fact that she's been sleeping her way through the male population of the city for the last few years and no one gives a damn. She's the one who cheated on me. Because I've done nothing. I don't hurt anyone. I keep myself to myself. I just look at pictures. I tell myself I'm a freaking idiot and I should get out of this place before it's too late, but I'm out of time. He's here. I hear footsteps right behind me. I smell him before I see him. I go to turn around, but he reaches out a hand lightning fast and grabs the back of my neck, stopping me from moving. Don't look at me, he hisses. Don't you fucking look at me. You don't need to see who I am. You understand? I whimper. I fucking whimper. 52-year-old man whimpering like a fucking baby. It's pathetic, but I do what he says. I don't argue, and I don't turn around. Why am I putting myself through this? I should have just walked away when she found out. Should have thrown in the towel and admitted defeat. I could have gone to Thailand or somewhere like that. Could have disappeared. But now it's too late because he's here and contact has been made. I try to look at his reflection in the cracked window, but he's directly behind me and I see nothing. He knows exactly what he's doing. I can smell him, hear him, feel him, but I can't bloody see him. And Jesus Christ, he smells so bad. It's a grubby, unwashed stench. Booze and bad breath and frequent whiffs of worse things. He makes me want to heave. I swallow down bile and try to compose myself. Sorry, I didn't think, I don't want your apologies, he says, his mouth against my ear. I just want you to do exactly what I say. Follow my rules and I'll do your job for you. Screw up and you're on your own. It's simple. I understand, but you're better. The fact we're having this conversation at all tells me you're already in a shitload of trouble. Pissing me off is only going to make things far worse. I keep telling myself to stay calm, but all I want to do is turn and run from this vile bastard and not look back. I go to the house, grab some things, then disappear into the night like I should have when she first found out. But I know I can't. It's too late now. He won't let me. He's a killer. A hitman. Christ, it even sounds stupid, like something out of a third-rate horror novel. Is this really worth the risk? Does Moira deserve to die? That's debatable, but she's backed me into a corner and taken away all my other options. If she tells anyone what she knows about the things I like to do, my life's as good as over. I've heard what they do to people like me in prison. So who is it? He asks. My wife. You don't say. Now there's a surprise. Been cheating on you, has she? Pretty much constantly for the last 10 years, but that's not the problem. I didn't think it would be. So why get in touch with me now? Tell me the full story. Well, why do you need to know? Because I need to be sure that you're serious. I need to know you're as desperate as you seem. This is a risk for both of us. I need to know you've got as much at stake as I have, as much to lose. Believe me, mate, I have. She knows things about me. What kind of things? Things I've done. Business deals? No, it's more personal than that. The kind of things I like. It's hard talking about this stuff, about my acquired tastes, even when I'm on my own in the house chatting online with like-minded people. Tonight, though, it's nigh on impossible. And when I don't immediately give him an answer, he starts taking random pot shots. I'm guessing it's either kids or animals, he says wearily. It's usually one or the other, sometimes both. Both? Don't sound so righteous, mate. You're in no position to judge. It's just that she's got evidence, I start to explain, telling him as little as possible, neither confirming nor denying. And if that evidence was to come out, well, I'd be screwed. Job gone, house gone, wife gone, cash gone, freedom gone. Straight to the slammer for you, you dirty little bastard. Yeah, that's about it. So why haven't you just done a runner? What? And leave her with everything? Do you have any idea what I'm worth? I do actually, he says. I knew money would come into this somewhere, it usually does. It's the root of all evil, you know. Is that right? He just laughs and finally relaxes his grip on the back of my neck. Okay, I get the picture. I know where you're coming from. Perversion's in the eye of the beholder, I say. One man's meat is another man's murder and all that bullshit. Exactly. Well, friend, he says, his sudden unexpected unwelcome familiarity making my skin crawl. You're in good company. We're both in the same boat to a certain extent. If people knew how I get my thrills, they wouldn't be too happy. And why's that? Well, it doesn't take a genius to work it out, does it? Let's just say I enjoy my work. Probably a little more than I should do. Shit. Is he into necrophilia? Will he want to have sex with Moira after he's killed her? I almost laugh out loud at the prospect of that. Good luck to him. Who am I to judge? For all I know, my particular quirks might still rank higher up the deviance league table than his. Is screwing a corpse any more socially acceptable than... Oh, okay, he says, derailing my bizarre train of thought. Here's the deal. The tone of his voice has changed again. This is deadly serious. He means business. Fact is, I get off on killing people. Can't tell you how or why it started. That's just how it is. There's something about doing someone in that drives me fucking wild. This is more of a hobby than a job for me, so I'm more than happy to help you out with your little problem. Now, I've made a few inquiries and I know a fair bit about you and your situation, and even more importantly, I know you know nothing about me. I know you can afford my fee, and I know you wouldn't be here unless you didn't have any other option. So all you need to do is agree to my terms and we'll get the ball rolling. Your terms, I ask, my throat dry and my voice barely audible. I thought I was just supposed to pay you in cash. I didn't know there were terms and conditions. There are always terms and conditions, he says, and he pauses ominously. It's a bit embarrassing, really, he explains, sounding sheepish now, like I've caught him playing with himself. I have superstitions. I'm a little bit OCD, I think. Superstitions? Yeah, just a couple. Nothing too weird in the overall scheme of things. Go on. Well, I only kill when I'm specifically asked to. Okay. And I only kill in pairs. All I hear is his second point. You only kill in pairs? Alarm bells are ringing again. So the fucker's gonna kill me once he's got rid of Moira. I try to make a run for it, but he anticipates. And anyway, he's far faster and far stronger than me. He shoves me up against the dirty glass and now I can't move. It's really not what you're thinking. I just don't like odd numbers. If you ask me to do a job, you have to ask me to kill 2 people. Yeah, but there's no one else I want dead. You don't have to name them, you prick. Just tell me to do it. Look, I'm sorry, but this is just how it is. Some people can't stop messing with light switches or washing their hands. Others won't step on the cracks in the pavement. Me, I get freaked out when I've killed an odd number of people. It's 2 or none. That's the rule, mate. You're talking about me, aren't you? Yeah, makes sense. Take me out and then there's less chance of anyone linking back to you. Forget it. Deal's off. This is bullshit. I should have just calmed down and take it easy, sunshine, he says, leaning up against me, his face too close for comfort, suffocating me with his halitosis. I've really got to come up with a better way of selling this to clients. Look, it won't be you, right? I'll find a second victim for myself. I just need your permission to kill them, okay? My permission? Just tell me I can do it, he says, getting frustrated. And his sudden anger makes my bladder weaken. All you need to know is it'll be someone you don't know. Someone you've never had any connection with. Someone who doesn't mean anything to you. But I don't understand. He shoves me against the window again, my face pressed so hard against the cold glass I think it's going to give. It turns me on, okay? We all have our little quirks, don't we? Some littler than others, if you know what I'm saying. Well, this is mine. You want one killing, but you have to order me to do two. Buy one, get one free. There'll be no repercussions for you, I swear. You won't know anything about it. Your only link to the killing will be me. And believe me, I'm not about to go public. I've got as much to lose as you have, probably more. He eases off, releases the pressure, steps away. I don't know about this. Are you still married, he asks. Yeah, just about. Is she insured? You still paying the premiums? I'll make it look like an accident. You could come out of this with a profit. Everyone's a winner. Everyone but your missus, he says ominously. Then he goes quiet. Too quiet. Oh, and I forgot to say I only kill on Mondays. That all right? What? You're taking the piss. Ah, you got me, he laughs, filling this ruin of a place with his foul noise. Just kidding. Look, pal, I know this is a big deal for you, and I expect you've never been involved in anything like this before. Chances are you won't be again. Your life must be a real fucking mess, because when people call for me, I know they've hit absolute rock bottom. I understand. I get it, I really do. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt. I know what you're going through, so I'm going to make this easy on you. I'm leaving now. If you want, you could do the same and you'll never hear from me again. But if you decide you want my help, you come back to this place before the weekend and leave me a sign. What kind of sign? I don't know. Use your imagination. Write something on the walls. Leave the cash here too. I'm in a no-win situation here. My options feel like they're reducing by the second, because I can either trust this sick bastard, and I never felt less like trusting anyone, or I can hope Moira keeps her mouth shut. But we both know that's not going to happen. Which is the lesser of these two evils? I stare out into the night through the grubby window and try to make sense of the chaotic thoughts filling my head. Okay, I tell him. I'll be back before the weekend. But he doesn't answer. I turn around to look for him, but the sly fucker's long gone, already disappeared into the darkness. Fuck it. I need a drink. I stop at the bar on the way home, trying to work out what the hell I should do. I could always just disappear, I tell myself again for about the 100th time tonight. Maybe fake my own death. Nothing feels definite enough. There's always a chance I'll be found, and I don't want to spend the rest of my days constantly looking over my shoulder. I've been doing enough of that as it is. I need Moira dead. That much is certain. I don't trust her and I can't pay her off. I need her gone. There are too many people in this bar. It's packed and I find myself looking from face to face to face, staring at each of them, hoping I don't see anyone I recognise or that anyone recognises me. I don't, of course, and that makes me feel a little better. I've never been here before, probably won't come here again. And for a few precious minutes I'm anonymous, innocent and free. I'm right in the middle of everything that's happening, but strangely disconnected from it all. You see that woman on her own over there? Oh, who's she? Why is she here? Why is she on her own? Is she waiting for someone? Has someone stood her up? Does she live alone? Is there anyone waiting for her at home tonight? If she never made it back, would anyone notice? Is she the one the hitman's going to kill if I ask him to do the job? And should I even give a shit? If she knew what got me into the mess I'm in, she'd be disgusted. But who's to say any of the other fuckers in here are any better? Who knows what goes on behind closed doors? There are tattooed freaks in here, others who look like alcoholics and addicts. In this bar, there could be rapists, gang bosses, traffickers, perverts who make me look like an angel. In comparison to this lot, I'm not hurting anyone. All I do is look at pictures on a screen. Bitch has got me by the balls. She's turfed me out of the house now, and she says she's going to the police. I know she'll do it soon if I don't take control of the situation. I'll give her her due. Sometimes Moira's business sense is almost as good as mine. She's biding her time. She's waiting. She's doing everything she can to get maximum profit, to maximise the damage and getting the most out of me she can before my inevitable fall from grace. I need to stop it. I need to take action. I went back around to the ruined high-rise this afternoon, straight from the solicitor's office. She really got me today, really got under my skin, so I made myself do it while I was still angry, before I had a chance to calm down and talk myself out of it. I climbed the stairs back up to the 7th floor, left the cash where he told me, then spray painted a message on the wall that no fucker could miss. Nothing. 2 weeks of waiting, 2 weeks of silence, but non-stop grief from her. I managed to convince myself that I'd been fucked over again. Either that the hitman was someone Moira had paid to set me up, or that the meeting had never happened in the first place. Had it just been a deluded, drink-fueled fantasy? I was on the verge of giving in when everything changed. I was starting to think I should just pay her off and damn the consequences. I'd agreed to the divorce and all her terms, and if she still went to the police, I'd already decided I'd go kicking and screaming. I'd tell them she knew everything. I'd tell them she helped feed my various unsavoury habits and implicate her somehow. But that's all academic now, because everything changed today. He's done it. She's dead. A police officer knocked on the door an hour or so ago. If I hadn't been so numb with panic, I'd have probably tried to make a run for it. I thought he'd come for me, you see, that she'd told them everything. But I could tell from the way he approached me, his submissive body language, his voice low, that wasn't the reason he was here. He asked if he could have a word, and that he was sorry, but he had some terrible news. And when he asked me to sit down, it was all I could do not to jump up and punch the air. I knew what was coming next. The hardest part was pretending I gave a shit. I just sat there, head bowed, looking down at the carpet, biting my lip to try and stop myself grinning. How? Was the only question I could ask. The investigation's still ongoing, sir, he explained, running through the usual disclaimers. On the face of it, though, looks like it was a tragic accident. It's going to take a while to piece things together, but it seems her car got stuck on a level crossing. There was no one else about. Seems your wife was trying to get it moved when the train hit. If it's any consolation, she died instantly. That was no consolation at all, actually, because I wanted her to suffer. It was a struggle to hide my emotions. I could have kissed the police officer, but that's really not my thing. In the 2 weeks since Moira died, I've experienced every emotion imaginable. Relief, guilt, paranoia, unadulterated joy, loneliness, regret, sorrow. Even now, almost 8 weeks on, and the way I feel about her continues to change virtually by the hour. We had some good times before the bad. I miss the woman I originally fell in love with, but, we both changed. I know what I had done to her was wrong, but she didn't leave me any choice. She could have just walked away. I'd have seen her all right, surely I would. But she took away all my other options and left me with only one. And now she's got the constant fear and uncertainty has gone with her. I don't feel good about what I did. The coroner's verdict was that her death was accidental. Credit where credit's due. My so-called friend knew exactly what he was doing. He covered his tracks impeccably and left nothing to chance. But then again, that's something else we got in common. When your personal tastes aren't socially acceptable, you do whatever needs doing to be discreet and keep things hidden. Who knows? If I'd as been as thorough as him in the first place, maybe I'd have avoided all this mess. There's no evidence of the hitman left at all now. Even the derelict flats where I met him have gone, demolished along with every trace of our meeting and agreement. I'm glad. If I never see him again, it'll be too soon. But the guilt's still there. I have to keep reminding myself what Moira could have done. She'd had the power to destroy me on every level with just a few words whispered to the wrong people. I tell myself daily that I did what I had to do, and that, in her own way, she was every bit as bad as me. Maybe in a far more socially acceptable way. She fucked scores of men in my bed and showered them with my money. My liaisons, on the other hand, they were all virtual. And I paid for access to the pictures and videos I wanted. I didn't even take them. Didn't meet anyone. I need to get over this and accept once and for all that she got what she deserved. It's odd though. I'm actually beginning to feel a little more remorse over the hitman's other killing now, the one I was forced to sanction. Some days I feel the guilt growing inside me like a cancer. But I keep telling myself no one's perfect. And the chances are that whoever he killed was as flawed as me in one way or another, maybe even more so. In this sordid, shitty little world we live in, you're hard pushed to find anyone who's completely, genuinely, 100% pure. We're all as bad as each other. Our so-called society breeds deviance and corruption like a disease, encourages it even. For fuck's sake, you can get whatever filth you like pumped directly into your home via the net. Kids in their bedrooms can get hold of worse stuff than I've watched with just a few clicks of the mouse. In public, I'm playing the grieving ex-husband, and I'll continue to do so until people stop watching me, until they stop checking I'm okay and asking how I'm coping. They mean well, but I could do without their offers of support. When I need a shoulder to cry on, I'll pay for one. It's late. I light a cigarette and slump back in my seat. A perfect evening draws to a close. Some me time in front of the computer with a few drinks and no interruptions. I sink into the chair and relax. My eyelids are getting heavy. There's a sudden sharp stinging pain in the side of my neck. I go to slap the bug or whatever it is away, but I can't. My arms are heavy and I can't feel my hands, can't even move them now. I try to get up, but I can't move. Whole body frozen. What the fuck? I smell him before I see him. It's the same foul reek I remember from before, filling my nostrils, and I know it's him. His stench is indescribable, but also instantly recognisable. I manage to move my head slightly, but it locks mid-turn like rusted machinery. I can see him moving out of the corner of my eye. He takes a couple of steps forward until he's in full view and he grins at me. It's the first time I've seen him properly, and I physically can't look away. There's no doubt it's him. And weirdly, the thing I feel most of all is disappointment, because he's so ordinary, so unexpectedly unimportant looking. He's no different to me. You'd struggle to pick either of us out in a crowd. My head droops slightly, and I can't lift it back up. I'm left staring at his crotch. Sick bastard has a hard-on. "Good evening," he says. "How you doing? It's been a while." I tried to talk, but my mouth has seized. Some sound comes out, single words at a time. "What doing? What am I doing here? Do you really have to ask? I'm finishing a job." "But..." "Oh, haven't you worked it out yet?" he continues, slipping his hand down the front of his trousers and starting to feel himself up. I was very careful to explain it all at the outset. "Remember what I told you?" He crouches down so that we're at eye level. Wish I could look away, but my eyes won't move. I can't even blink now. "You said..." I start to say, every word an effort, having to work hard to make any noise. "Look, I'll remind you," he says, catching my cigarette as it falls from my frozen fingers. He takes a long drag, his hard cock gripped tight with his other hand. He pauses for a second and stops wanking, almost losing control. "You have to excuse me, I fucking love this." "Why, you here?" "Well, look, I told you I only kill in twos, and I said I only kill when someone asked me to do it. It's a bit weird, I know, but that's just how I roll. You should know better than that, my friend. You can't control what gets you horny." I suck in more air, forcing my jaw to move again, managing to spit out a few words. "You said not me." "And that's exactly right," he says. He grins as he leans closer, my cigarette between his teeth. He knocks my drink off the table next to the chair and onto my lap with his free hand. The whiskey soaks my clothes, but I can't feel it. The bottle rolls off the table and hits the floor. Well, I killed your wife and some other loser, just like you asked, he says. And why you here? I'm on another job now, he says, and he lets the cigarette fall from his lips. He grins and rocks back on his heels. I see wisps of smoke, then the flicker of the first few blue flames, almost invisible. He pulls my head up, then steps back as the fire takes hold. He's watching me as he's jerking off, face screwed up with concentration. The guy who asked me to do this job was a lot like you, actually, he says. Desperate, self-obsessed, completely broken. You're someone else's murder number 2 now, my friend. He didn't know you, he didn't know anything about you, and you mean nothing to him and he means nothing to you. Did it sound familiar? Don't worry though, pal. I'll get to him eventually. That's the deal. So there you go. Apologies for the barely suppressed coughing fits. That's thanks to a bout of COVID last week. What a joy. I hope you enjoyed my sordid little story. If you want to know more about me, if I haven't put you off completely, then you can find out loads more about my work on www.davidmoody.net, or find me on Facebook and Instagram at David Moody Author, or on Twitter at David J. Moody. Thanks again for listening.